So once we have most of the skirt complete, the skirt and the lining are generally made, and now we join them at this waistline. Now I have my waistband pattern. Clearly, there are notches that absolutely must be notched. So we have this. Notice all of the notches appear on only one side of the pattern. That leaves the other side no notches, and that is ultimately the side that we're going to do our Hong Kong finish on. So I'm going to take the pattern off. Got my notches in. And I did show you guys how to make your bias. So I cut my bias 1 1/4 inches, and like I said before, pressing as you go makes a big difference in the how this turns out, basically. So what I'm going to do is this is the side that has no notches. I am going to sew it on the wrong side. I'm going to start here at the end, 1/4 of an inch only. Side that has not been pressed down. This side is pressed. We're doing the side that is not pressed. This is just a really nice finish instead of using, let's say, just an overlock. It gives it a little bit more of character to the execution of the skirt. Now be careful while you're sewing not to pull this, because then you're going to make this ultimately a little bit narrower, and it's going to be harder to create that Hong Kong finish. I mean, I don't know if it would be better if it were pinned, but if you would feel more comfortable doing that, please do it. Anything to get the job done more efficiently. Hmm? Yes. And if you wanted to, it's even nicer to do it like a scant 1/4 of an inch. Just because you'll see when I turn it, the more I have to work with the bias, the easier it will be. Okay, we don't need this extra. I will cut it off, but I won't cut it completely off. Now, technically, all we're going to do is we're going to take this and turn it. Now, ideally, if you're working with this, it's not a bad idea to press this. So I'll press this because you want it to be as flat as possible. Don't forget, sew it on the wrong side. It will become much easier, and sorry. The finish will look better. Thank you. Be careful that you don't press down to your 1/4 of an inch. See how much you got to work with? The more you have to work with, the better it will be. Okay, so now that my bias is pressed, you can see it's a pretty decent size. That's really ultimately what you want, because now the only thing left to do, and with all the pressing that I've done, it's clearly going to make the job much easier. I'm going to turn this down, and I'm going to stay consistent with the turn that I make, so that this bias remains pretty much the same size all the way across the entire waistband. And the reason I did it I sewed it initially on the back is because now this is the side you'll ultimately see on the skirt. So you want it to be as precise and as professional looking as possible. And it's a good idea to go slowly, because you want to stitch this bias on the very edge. Probably not a good idea to pin it, because the pins make it a little bit uneven sometimes. But all that pressing is making my job a whole lot simpler. The other thing too is, if you wanted to make your job even simpler, is you could press this down so that when it's time to just sew on the edge, you don't really have anything to do other than stitch that edge. You really do have to be careful. Anytime you're pressing now, the last thing you want to do is eliminate the part rather that you already pressed, because it always runs the risk when you want to do some additional pressing, that you're going to press out some of the turn down that you've already just pressed into that. Now, clearly, the fabric that I'm using is relatively thin, so it's better to use an average weight fabric for your Hong Kong, as opposed to something that's really heavy, because the turning will not be simple. So that's my finished Hong Kong edge on my waistband. Now I will trim all my excess off. Okay, so there's my waistband. Make sure I get it in the camera. Okay, questions? Anybody so far? Now, here comes the good part. We're going to start to sew this waistband on each edge. Let's see what it suggests. All right, well, this order of operations suggests sewing this on before you sew the corners. So let's do it that way. This is a little bit trickier. Now, remember, I did all my notches. There is a notch here, so that I have a little bit from this notch to the edge, I have an extension. Because technically what you need when you make a waistband is one side is going to be flush with the skirt here. The other side is going to extend under the waistband, so that you can technically put a hook and eye or a button in a button. So this would be the perfect time to pin. I'm looking that doesn't have a notch. That means we only want to do the 1/2 inch. So that's what our seam allowance is going to be on this waistband. And if that's accurate, then all of my other notches, let's see where they are. Oh, center front, I have a center front notch. That's critical. Find the center front, right there. Pin that. Technically, you'll see how it lines up. Then when we get to the other side, that's the part that we need to pay more attention to because that's the overlap side. It will extend past, see my notches there, and that's going to be on the edge of where it's going to meet the zipper so that we have it looking like that. Pin that. So this is going to be extended. So it's not a bad idea to pin everything. Now, because I sewed my lining to my skirt, it's going to make that part much simpler. Sometimes because there's notches in here, it gives it a little bit more of a release, that it's not as narrow, as it's a little bit wider than it should be because the notches are separating a little bit. So just be aware of that and pin it accordingly so that if you have to ease it in a little bit, do so. That's what I'm doing. Now, anytime you are trying to sew two things together and one has a little bit more give than the other, then the foot has a tendency to put pressure on whatever this top fabric is going to be, and it drags it. So that's the side that you want to sew if the side that's a little bit bigger. It will drag it and it will probably wind up being the size you want it to be without you having to do anything. And let's just say, you took a little bit less than the amount for the notch. Ooh, then that's going to create, one side being longer than the other. Okay, I think that happened. Let me see. There's a couple more things here I need. Okay, so I have everything pinned. Waistband to the skirt. Seam allowance is 1/2 inch. clearly there's at least a half of an inch here because this is your other seam allowance that you're going to do after the waistband is sewn on. So the whole waistband gets stitched to half an inch. I like to do, when I started, you absolutely need to back, but if I get caught, I prefer to take the pins out before I get to them because that runs the risk of me breaking a needle. Now, the whole time I'm sewing this, despite the fact that I stitched this, I'm going to double check as I go that I don't have a pleat that's caught in the lining. That should be something that you want to do for everything that you do. It's amazing how many things get caught up underneath that you don't want to get caught. Double checking underneath as I go all the way. Removing my pins before I get to them. You just don't want to break a needle. And that is an accident waiting to happen. Making sure that I always do everything happening. This will, even though we're not making these for ourselves or for anybody, it will alter the fit of the skirt if the seam allowance is different than the pattern. So try to be consistent with that because we want that skirt to fit. And I think that the best perspective when you're doing these things is to make sure that what you create here is something that if you were in a store that you would be willing to buy because it's finished right. Sure I'm good underneath. Yep. Let's keep going. See, in the way this pin right here that I have, this pin underneath, it's pinning the lining in a way that I do not want to sew. So before I get to that pin, I am going to release that and make sure that my lining is flat. My lining is really thin. If you have a little bit of a thicker lining, absolutely want to make sure. That's when it happens more times than not. It buckles up, it pleats up, whatever. Oh, I have extra. So I've decided because of the way mine was lining up, the best way for me to do it was to stitch the waistband on the top. It's also a good idea to double check while you're sewing, making sure that this stopper on the zipper is not what you're sewing on top of. You want a little bit of an ease amount between the stopper and the stitching to finish this off. So now I have the entire waistband stitched on. Okay. Now, it's not a bad idea to press this also. I'm going to trim my threads. We have a few little minor challenges when we do this burrito. Now, this is the part that's extended. So what we're going to do is, technically, we should put it in the camera. Technically, this waistband has a 1/2 inch seam allowance on this side. Let's see if I could move my fingers. On that side. It's going to get stitched to this side. Now, there is a notch here that represents where you're going to fold this waistband in half. Utilizing that notch, this side is clearly bigger than the waistband. So I'm going to turn that bias Hong Kong edge down. And I'm going to sew this a 1/2 inch. You can see, here's where my notch is. That's where you fold down the waistband. Pattern has been engineered for a waistband to be about 1 inch. One side. It's a little bulky, so when we try to turn that corner down, be especially mindful of that. Now, we're going to do the other side. On this side, it's not so critical because technically we do not have to burrito this because it actually is right on the edge. So we're going to put, again, find my notch that represents the fold of the waistband. And I'm just going to sew that with the waistband turned up and the burrito is showing. That's fine because you'll see when we stitch this down, this won't be an issue. Because when you do that, look, we're going to stitch it in the ditch. This waistband, we're going to stitch it in the ditch, and we don't see any of that bias coming to the front of the waistband. So we don't need to fold it under. This is fine. The next step is actually press everything. Press all of your seam allowance going towards the waistband. And then it's a good idea to press the waistband down like in half, the way it was engineered in the pattern. Okay, I can't go there right now. Do we have any questions? Give me a minute or so. All right. Okay, I'm going to press. This is a good time to evaluate. If you said you're lining correctly, you won't have any pleats in here. So by pressing it, what I've done is save myself some of the work because I don't need to do anything to manipulate it so that I make sure that it's enhanced. I've pressed it exactly the way it needs to be. And this side, like I said, has the Hong Kong bias showing. Okay. Now, the only thing really that I have left to do is to stitch the waistband down. And I'm stitching it in the ditch. You could also, if you have not a large extension, you could also stitch it on the edge of the waistband, but I'm going to do it in the ditch. See, it's really not even noticeable. That's the reason why I wanted to do it this way, because I'm using a contrasting color of thread. So now it's simple when we're doing just the waistband, but until we get to the other side where the extension is. And I'm feeling what I have on going on underneath so that I'm not stitching anything that I don't want to stitch. Pretty long waistband, so be patient. Take your time. This is the most critical part of the whole skirt, so take your time. I know it's hard to see with all this plaid, but I am stitching it in the ditch. I'm going to do something. I'm not going to go all the way to the end because I want you to see something. So clearly on the front of the skirt, you don't even see the stitch. On the back, you do. That's why I stitched it on the front. I want it to be even. This is the critical part. This extension that we need to do this, we need to burrito the part that is the bias. So this is a good thing, a good time to pin this. Making sure that we don't see any of that coming from underneath, because we're going to stitch just this here And we don't want that bias to be shown. Now, clearly we won't, there's no ditch to stitch this in, so we have to stitch it on the very edge of this waistband. But we turned up our bias so we can stitch it down. Now, a little bit of it is showing, so I want to turn it as the best I can. If you feel comfortable pressing it, that's not a bad idea. Now, I put a pin just about at the zipper, and that's where I'm going to burrito it. Now, when you get to this part, it doesn't matter. You're going to start to release this so that you can catch it in the ditch. But the only part that matters is this extension piece, and we stitch it on the edge. Oops, sorry. It's a little thick. Stitch it on the edge until I get to the zipper. I'm going to back tack right where that pin was. Now I'm going to stitch the rest of the way in the ditch, meet the other stitching where it ended. And that's what it looks like on the inside. So you can see I folded it under completely. The length of this extension plus another 1/2 inch. And then I started to release it and stitch it in the ditch. So now this bias shows. This side, I just folded it in half and I stitched because you do not see any of that bias poking out, but it's a clean finish on the inside. Okay, so let's work on our waistband. The only thing we have really left to do is the hem. So we'll work on that in a while. Okay, so let's get your waistband started. Where's that? Pause. Okay. Basically, all of your notches are in the skirt. So what it is, it's a 2-inch hem. I've overlocked the edge. It's a 2-inch hem. Use any hand stitching method that you prefer to finish the hem off. As far as the lining goes, there's also a notch there. It's 1 inch above. But technically the only thing we're going to do is, and again, once again, I press this because it makes it simpler to do. Pressed it down 1/2 inch, and I'm going to turn it again another 1/2 inch and stitch it on the edge. And that's going to be my lining here. Try to get this skirt. Pressing it, that eliminates the necessity for me to have manual do it by hand as I'm sewing. It eliminates one of the steps. Just makes it a nicer finish. So that would be the lining hem. As you can see, I turned it up a half an inch and then another half of an inch, and that's complete. Nice little press. Do your actual skirt hem 2 inches, overlocked edge. Any stitch of your choice, hand stitch is fine. And then the one thing you have left to do is to put a nice by hand, a skirt hook and eye on the waistband. And that's the entire skirt operation. So work hard, complete the skirt, and if, like I said, if you have any issues with some of the operations, I do have another YouTube video of the skirt on my channel on YouTube under my name. So because we can't, that video seemed to have disappeared, you can access another video. So if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me. So I'm going to keep this open if you have any questions.